Hello, Mark, and welcome everybody. Welcome to the spiritual power of resilience, but it's the subtitle that really hooked me on this class when Mark suggested it. And it's how to stay sane in crazy times, because I don't think we have experienced anything as crazy as what the world is going through now, at least not in our lifetimes.
I agree. I certainly do agree, Carolyn. But the truth is that folks have always gone through times of terrible turmoil and challenge and division,
Yeah.
and we have tools for how to work with them, which is why I wanted to offer this class.
Well, that's why I said this couldn't be more necessary. So why don't you have at it? Love the life you have, amor fati, and call me at the end.
We will. We will.
Okay.
Thank you, Carolyn. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could join us for this four-part series. We're going to be looking at ancient wisdom teachings that have helped people for millennia to get through some of the hardest times in history. Suffering is an integral part of what it means to be a human being in this divided and difficult world. And we've always had wisdom principles that can help to strengthen our power of resilience and our power of self awareness, which is how we free ourselves at times when our back's against the wall, we don't know where to turn or how to act. There are teachings that can help us, and that's what we're going to be focusing on for the next four sessions together. Now, today we're going to be starting with the principle of controlling what is within our sphere of influence and letting go of what we can't control. Dan, could you just pull up that first card, please? Here we go. Epictetus, the Greek-born slave turned philosopher, put it this way. He said, "The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control." You can drop that card now. What Epictetus is talking about is what psychologists refer to as an internal locus of control, developing that internal locus. Spiritual teachings from the Stoics to the Buddhists through the Christians and across psychology and self-development modalities all warn us that strengthening this internal locus of control is absolutely key to cultivating resilience in difficult times. Having an internal locus of control means believing that your actions and your choices and your abilities are the primary drivers of your life's outcomes instead of external forces or luck. We're going to talk more about the internal locus of control later in the session. Now, as spiritual seekers, most of us know that our internal guidance is more than just analysis and reason and our ability to think our way through challenging times. Instead, the internal locus of control also relies on what can be called inner knowing, which is connected to instinct, to intuition, and to the voice of the spirit, the still small voice within, that all of us have inside of ourselves. As Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, listen to the whisper only you can hear. Listen to the whisper only you can hear. And in order to do that, we need to get quiet. We need to learn how to leave the voices of the outside world at a distance so that we can tune into this thing in us that is born with an innate knowledge of what is balanced, what is healthy, what is whole, what moves us toward integrity and healing, and what divides us, what puts us into suffering and decreases our ability to bounce forward when we are knocked down. The whisper that only you can hear is the voice of your inner knowing, and it's a lot more reliable than many of us tend to realize. And in times of turmoil, times like today that threaten to drown out that wisdom voice, recognizing the inner guidance, recognizing this internal locus of control is more important than ever. Now, as all of us know, we are being barraged 24/7 by information coming at us from all corners, much of it upsetting, and dysregulating. Life in this electronic age can be absolutely overwhelming and deeply confusing. The din of technology and social media drowns out the still small voice within us. And that leaves us adrift in this current of bad news and the squawk box of public opinion. Never has public opinion been more prized than it is today. Everybody's got an opinion, and social media allows us to blast that opinion around the world in a matter of seconds. So if we don't protect ourselves, if we don't protect our inner world, we're going to be subject to and victimized by this barrage of information coming at us at all times. The truth is that it's hard to hear yourself think these days. And we wonder why anxiety and depression levels are through the roof. One study showed that the average high school student today suffers higher levels of anxiety than the child under psychiatric care in the 1950s. That's how extreme it is. Distracted by all of this noise and all of this information, our attention spans have shrunk dramatically, which also has terrible effects on our psychological well-being and our spiritual connection. They did a study on attention that showed that people spend approximately 45% of their time thinking about things other than what they're actually doing, or being psychologically somewhere other than where they actually are. So you combine that attention deficit with this onslaught of information, much of it false information, and you have a recipe for suffering, for imbalance, and most importantly, for a loss of personal power. And that's how we fall prey to propaganda and being controlled by outside forces in societies that are veering toward groupthink and toward autocracy. Now, I'm not going to get too political in this course. We could do 4 sessions on the MAGA movement. We're not going to do that, okay? But I will be obviously referring to what's going on in this country in general terms, so that we can learn how to be with this negativity and this onslaught of difficulty without losing our buoyancy and our joy and our sense of self. Now, autocracies operate on the principle of fear, and they seek to keep us dependent on systems that are meant to control our thinking and keep us subjugated. Because when we're scared and when we're convinced that our survival is at stake, we tend to look at powers outside of ourselves to save us. We also become more fearful of outsiders, as in us versus them, less willing to question authority, more isolated, insulated, and less self-reliant. That's what fear does. Being in a fearsome and a fear-inducing environment is profoundly disempowering. As we become less well-informed, ignorance makes us easier to manipulate. We're more easily duped by what we're told, even when the sources of information are questionable or even bogus. In fear-driven times, like the times we're in today, it's far easier to jump on one propaganda bandwagon or another, to cling to some fixed ideology, to choose teams and then remain divided, than it is to think for ourselves and stand on our own 2 feet. Identifying with outside authority gives us a false sense of security. And it can also alleviate the feelings of terror and dread and powerlessness that are so threatening and overwhelming. So if we can somehow cling onto something bigger than us that claims to have all the answers, that's one way of moving through hard times without actually developing an internal locus of control. And that's counter to resilience. Right? Resilience doesn't come from projecting our responsibility or our ability to modulate our own inner lives onto some outside authority. Obviously, it comes from reclaiming the power that is already and always within us. Okay. Resilience doesn't come from turning over our control or clinging to some outside sources of strength, however convincing they may appear. Freedom and resilience only come from tapping into our inner knowing and letting go of things over which we have no power. And that is absolutely key. It's the most important thing that we can remember in times when we feel so overpowered, is recognizing the limitations of our power. It's a paradox. That's what strengthens us. As Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, put it, quote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Okay? You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. So as we come more and more into our own self-reliance, as we become more mindful, tune more deeply into our innate wisdom, we gain power, we gain resilience, we gain wherewithal, right? This ability, this sense of being equal to the challenges around us. So, what exactly does it mean to say that we have power over our own minds? This is a very important point. I'm not suggesting, no one would suggest that we can control our own thoughts, because no one in the world can control his or her own thoughts. The greatest meditator in the world can't control their minds. The Dalai Lama has a monkey mind, just like the rest of us. Instead, having power over your mind means having the ability not to overreact to circumstances, not to believe your own stories, and not to become too attached to outcomes. Because that's, of course, what the mind is always trying to do, create stories that somehow that promise to dictate outcomes, which gives us a false sense of control. But that false sense of control always leaves us with an underlying anxiety because we know we're not. We don't. We know the limitations of our power. We know we can't predict or control what happens. And yet we tell ourselves that we can through these kinds of deceptive stories. So it's an important step to recognize that, to see how we use the story-making mind to create a false sense of security, and not be duped by it, right? Not be duped by this illusion of control, right? Joan Didion said, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And that's true up to a point. But telling ourselves stories doesn't give us more control. It gives us the illusion of control. Recognizing that we don't have control over what is outside our sphere of influence means recognizing the power of self-witnessing, the power of observing our own inner lives, our thoughts and our feelings, which is really our ace in the hole on the path of well-being. This ability to observe ourselves, to gauge our own thinking, to modulate our own feelings is known in psychology as metacognition. And metacognition is what makes it possible for us to choose how we respond to experience, which in turn is absolutely essential to building resilience. Right? Resilience and response are intimately connected to one another. This power of self-awareness is sometimes called in spiritual circles the witness, right? It's this ability to witness ourselves that gives us a modicum of control over our inner lives. And it really is our greatest tool as human beings when it comes to interrupting our own destructive thinking and quickening our healing and our insight, right? It's what helps us truly helps us when outside events are really beyond our control, tuning into our own responses. Knowing that you have the ability to question your own reactions and then choose different ways of responding makes you infinitely stronger and more resilient. When you recognize that in nearly all situations, barring physical torture, you do have the ability to adapt, to use your imagination, and to exemplify courage and compassion, which can bring enormous relief, particularly in times of great chaos and hardship. You may remember the great passage from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he describes witnessing extreme acts of bravery and resilience during his time as a prisoner in Auschwitz, Dan, could you pull up that next card, please? Here we go. As Franco wrote, we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. Isn't that beautiful? We can drop that card now. Recognizing what you can control and what you can't is what defines what Frankl is calling the last of the human freedoms. And it's a freedom that we need passionately today. We need it. In a way, as Carolyn was saying at the outset, that we never have before, particularly in this country, because we are being faced by a level of darkness and control and injustice that most of us have never faced, certainly not on a national level. So when it comes to resilience and maintaining an internal locus of control, we can learn a lot from people like Viktor Frankl who have survived in extremis. In fact, these survivors are our master teachers, I suggest, for how to move through the period that we are going through now, and learning when to struggle and when to surrender, knowing when to fight and when to take our hands off the wheel. We can look at these master survivors and they will guide us through this period if we let them and if we listen. I wrote a book years ago called When You're Falling, Dive, where I spoke to a whole range of people who had gone through major suffering and loss in their lives and come through the ordeals larger rather than smaller, deeper instead of more shallow, both psychologically and spiritually. I wrote the book because I wanted to know how these people had done it, because that had been my own experience as well in my own life. I was diagnosed with a fatal illness in my late 20s, and I saw firsthand what happens when we're faced with the limitations of our own control and we're forced to find a way to persevere anyway. I've been through this, and I've seen the paradoxical thing that happens when we turn it over and when we learn how to surrender. The challenge of being pushed to the edge with nowhere to go except inward, and the fierce grace that emerges when we allow ourselves to trust the wisdom inside and the forces greater than we are, is actually a godsend on the path of self-realization. So I wanted to talk to other people like me who had experienced what they call post-traumatic growth and find out how they'd done it, what had happened, how that had happened for them. And one of the wisest people I spoke to is an MD named Rachel Naomi Remen, who's an author and truly one of the deepest and most helpful people I've ever encountered. Rachel came to, like me, Rachel came to this wisdom firsthand in her own experience. She was diagnosed with Crohn's disease when she was 18 years old. She was told that she would not live past 40. And she was absolutely enraged. Here was a young woman planning to be a doctor, planning to have a family and children, being told that she would never have children, that she'd be dead by 40, and that she really needed to pull back her expectations and basically live as a person waiting to die. And Rachel was so enraged by this. She tells a wonderful story about walking down the beach in her late teens. At one point, she was so angry over this diagnosis and the pessimism of her doctors that she had a kind of a breakthrough. And she realized that the anger she was feeling was itself an energy that she needed to learn how to channel toward insight, toward creativity, toward her own healing. And that as anger, in the way that she was experiencing it, it didn't really have that power. She needed to learn how to channel her own anger. It also helped that in addition to being a scientist, or a scientist to be, she was also raised by a grandfather who was an Orthodox rabbi and a scholar of the Kabbalah. So she had grown up immersed in mystical teachings and a mystical way of looking at the world, in addition to being a scientist. And I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that Rachel said to me about resilience and control and surrender. Could we pull up the next card, please? Here we go. Confronted by enormous change, losing a breast, a country, a child, we're faced with an important choice. Either we come to surrender, go into the loss, attend to our own responses, and listen to ourselves, or we attempt to put it behind us and get on with the rest of our lives. When we try to avoid loss or plow through our pain, our lives are actually diminished. Next card, please. On the other hand, there's an extraordinary wisdom and clarity that emerges in people who genuinely meet their pain, not in theory, but in life. We realize that there is a larger power operating which can be trusted to sustain us. As any woman who's gone through delivery knows, it's minute by minute when the going gets rough. The forces that are happening are so great that the woman surrenders. She has to. Often it's the moment just before birth. Isn't that wonderful? And that's how we can learn to dance with the powers within us and the greater forces outside of us, knowing when to surrender and when to take control, right? To use the agents that we have, but not abuse it by imagining that we can do it all ourselves. We can't. And it's key to remember that as we learn the practice of spiritual resilience. Genuine strength and resilience depend on knowing when to stop struggling, when to push, which is absolutely necessary sometimes, as anyone knows who's gone through childbirth, and when to pause. Right. So I'm going to be offering you prompts during these sessions that are questions that I suggest you reflect on in your own time. And the first one I want to suggest is, what are you trying to control that you can't? What are you not controlling that you can? Those two questions can go a long way toward laying out the basic groundwork of where you are when it comes to an internal locus of control and where it is that you're giving your power away unnecessarily. So reflect on these questions. What are you trying to control that you can't, and what are you not controlling that you can? Now, the best method I know for exploring these kinds of deep questions is writing. And as a writer, I'm a bit prejudiced when it comes to using writing for self-inquiry, but it really is unparalleled. And it's a time-honored tradition going back to the ancient Stoics of using writing as a path of self-inquiry and pursuing deep questions toward insight in the privacy of our own practice. I call this practice writing to awaken, and it's geared specifically toward this kind of psychological and spiritual self-inquiry. If you're not interested in writing, if writing turns you off, talk to a therapist, talk to a friend, or simply reflect on these questions on your own. But questions are part of our superpower, as I like to call it, when it comes to personal awakening and when it comes to self-liberation. Questions are your superpower. Without the questions, you can't open the door. So hold these questions for your own practice, and I do suggest going into them in your own time. So now let's think about some things that we typically try to control that we can't, and the damage that's caused by investing our inner energies where they have no power. Okay. Let's just go through a kind of a greatest hits list of things we try to control that we can't, that then end up burning us out or leaving us feeling hopeless. The first one is other people's perception of us. Just think of how much time you waste with what psychologists call reputation management. How much time do you spend trying to manage your own reputation, managing how people think of you, whether you're approved of or not, earning their respect or not, trying to build up your status or fall out of other people's consideration, losing power in a social sense. Right? How can you interrupt that impulse to try to control other people's perceptions of you? What do you do? How are you trying to jump through other people's hoops in ways that are inauthentic or damaging or disempowering? That's a one great place to start. The next thing we try to control that we can't is what other people do. And we all know that. Anyone who's ever been in a relationship knows the temptation to control other people's behavior. It doesn't work. It never does. And yet we continue to do that just automatically, reflexively. Often it's so that we won't be disappointed. At other times, it's so that other people won't leave us. There are lots and different reasons why we try to control other people's behavior, but they're all equally doomed. And they sap us of vital energy. And we also can feel defeated over things that really have nothing to do with us. Let's say we're trying to help somebody, right? I'm going to help you. And that person doesn't take to our help or doesn't have the desired effect. We can actually feel like we've failed in some way because we haven't shifted another person's trajectory in their lives, right? When we see the disconnect there, when we see the impossibility of that, it can free us of that impulse to try to control other people and tell them what to do. The next thing we try to control that we can't is the past and the future. We spend a lot of time in rumination. In fact, rumination is understood to be one of the primary causes of depression. Living in the past, trying to control what has happened, which sounds absurd, but we do it all the time by changing the story, shifting, arguing with ourselves, arguing with the past. We lose our own agency. It takes us out of the present moment. And again, we can feel like failures because of what has happened in the past that we have no ability to change. Likewise, we try to control what's going to happen in the future. A lot of our energy goes toward predicting outcomes, trying to assure our own success, trying to waylay something or prevent something we don't want to happen from happening. When, of course, that is outside of our power to influence. So if we hope to be more resilient, we need to let go of this fake idea, this illusion that we can somehow, through our own clever thinking or our own engineering minds, that we can somehow engineer the past and the future. We can't. We have almost no influence on them, except in the present. Of course, we can take certain actions that are more likely to lead to positive outcomes. Yes, but those always happen in the present moment. We can't control the future. The next thing we try to control that we can't is our physical bodies. You can do a lot to improve your health. You can certainly be attuned to your energy. There are ways that you can ameliorate physical symptoms by changing habits, changing behaviors. Absolutely. But you can't stop yourself from aging. You can't stop yourself from dying, right? We can't change our physical bodies. We're in these vehicles, and our job is to learn how to inhabit them optimally, as wisely as we can, with humility. Understanding that we may be able to channel healing energy. We have a lot of power when it comes to self-healing. But that power isn't us. It's not coming from us. That power is coming from beyond us. It's absolutely critical to understand that as seekers. Years ago, I met a fantastic healer and world famous mystic known as Daskalos. He was a Cypriot healer, and he was attributed, many miracles were attributed to him, and amazing healings. And when I interviewed him, I said, Daskalos, how do you do this? How do you heal so many people? And he said, no, I don't do it. I don't do anything. He said, Joshua Emmanuel the Christ. That is the energy that's coming through me. It is not Spiro Sati, this 80-year-old Cypriot man. Okay, and so it's important to understand where healing comes from and to get out of the way and see that we can't control what happens inside our bodies. We can create conditions that ameliorate or hurt us physically, but when it comes to aging and when it comes to mortality, it's out of our hands. The next thing we try to control is pain, not only physical pain, but also emotional pain. But as all of us know, pain comes with the territory of being a human being and an incarnate creature in this dualistic world. Right? We can't make pain go away. Later on in the session, we'll be talking about pain and suffering, and we certainly have impact over whether or not we suffer. But pain is a given. So we can't control pain. And knowing that, as anyone knows who's been in chronic pain, knowing you can't control that pain is a big first step toward lessening that pain, because it's the resistance to the pain often that makes it worse than it needs to be.